How are you? I hope you're all well. Today we're going to be talking about terminology and translation. So I'm going to share my screen now, if I can. Okay. Can you see it? Okay. So let's start. My name is Bruna. So nice to meet you. I'm very happy to be here tonight. I like this topic a lot, and it was a delight to be invited to speak to you. I'm gonna start then by, I'm having trouble with the technology. Okay, it went back. All right. Great. So terminology for translation. Terminology is something that's very important for translators in general. We have, I'm a translator, I'm not going to speak about myself. So terminology is very important for translators because it is extremely decisive for you to have an accurate translation. Therefore, we need to care about it. And it is hard sometimes to identify what is a term, what isn't a term, what's just a difficult word that you don't know or that you are not very familiar with. So I believe it is, we should have more of a terminology. We should study more terminology as translators, and this is my contribution to it. So terminology for translations is going to be a little bit different than for lexicographers or the like, because we have a very specific goal to achieve. So what we want is to have the most accurate translation, and of course, accurate translation is a very peculiar concept in the sense that there's a lot of difference in how people are going to define accurate translation, but bear with me. If you, regardless of whether you believe one line or a different line of what is a good translation, you're going to need to work with terminology. So to begin with, I suggest we establish what is a term. Now, a term in a general sense is a synonym of a word or lexical unit with a specific concept that is represented by it. So what you have is a word or a compound word that have a specific meaning. Okay, so we have in the general sense, a term is any word, compound word, or multi-word expression that has a meaning, any given meaning. Okay, but we're not talking about terms in general when we talk about translation. We're talking usually about technical terms or specialized terms. In this sense, how do we differentiate between terms in general and technical terms or specialized terms? The specialized term, the technical term, it's gonna deviate from the meanings the same words have in other contexts and in everyday language. So the difference is gonna be that you have a word that is usually used in the general language, in the everyday language everybody speak, like the common language that you'd use in non-specific contexts, like when you talk to your parents or when you go to the mall or whatever you do in your life. You have an everyday language that the majority of the population share and speak in. But you have these words that they are extracted from everyday language and use it in specialized contexts. And in those contexts, their general meaning that they have in everyday language is no longer accurate. They become something else, more specific. Like many words have a plethora of meanings, right? When you talk about a technical term, it rarely has more than one definition because it's much more specific to a context. So in it lies the importance of such terms, right? Is the way that they condense a mass of information into a single word or small lexical unit with a couple words or a few words. This condensation of meaning is what makes them important and useful in specialized language, and also what makes them tricky when you are talking about translation, right? Because if the translation relies only in the general meaning, that's gonna be hard to come up with a translation that is accurate in the sense that it's gonna be explaining the same things or saying the same things that the original text said. And therefore, translators need to pay a lot of attention to these terms. I'm sorry, it's not changing the slide, and I needed to change. Okay, so to continue where we stopped, the whole idea of technical and specialized terms are, I selected this quote because I think it's relevant in this sense. A language here, it says it's a word, but technical fields or subject areas, they are also smaller words inside within a language. And therefore, we need to make sure that we're not only entering this different wider word, but that we're also gonna go, I'm sorry, let me turn off the speaker now. So we need to make sure as translators that we are able to enter this smaller word that is inside this different language. And therefore, we need to be attentive because sometimes it is very, very tricky to identify technical terms. And how can translators work with terminology in a better or easier manner? Usually we adopt glossaries, right? We can get glossaries from other people. We can have specialized glossaries from a subject field or area. They can be within many fields or a more specific, smaller field inside a bigger or wider subject area. And they can be multilingual. They can be lists of words of equivalent terms. There is a multitude of ways to create a glossary. However, for the purpose of translation, some things, some items should be included in glossaries, right? Okay. tokens. So we go to glossary entries. If you can identify the terms that you are working with, and here it is, of course, very finite the way you can define what is important. That depends on what areas you work with, what languages you work with, how specific you need the glossary to be, or how wide, if you work alone or if you work with a team. It all is gonna change how you organize the glossary. However, once you identify the terms, the most important thing is the way you're gonna go about research. And why is that? Because, as I said, it can be very tricky, and everybody that has ever worked with translation knows that. You can get something that seems like a very, very simple word or term or idea, and then when you start looking for an equivalent in a different language, you realize that's much more complex than it looks initially, because you have a different context and a different culture. Myself, for instance, I work with law and economics, and that's also very different depending on where you are, right? It's all very culturally sensitive. So the concepts sometimes are non-existent in different contexts for speakers of a different language. And you still have to find a way around it. Having a predetermined approach to your research, and that's where a glossary, maintaining a glossary or multiple glossaries comes in hand, because you having this method to go about doing your research for technical terms, it's going to help you make this journey a little less complicated. And how do we do that? I ask and I'm going to answer it as well. Because unlike I usually prefer classes that are interactive to have people actually participating in, and this is not the case here, so I'm going to be speaking on my own. I'm going to answer my own question. So, glossary entries. You have to decide what's important to you. However, there are some things that are good to be included in your glossary. And depending on how you go about your work, you're gonna identify what's more important or relevant or less relevant for you. And you can, of course, change and adapt your glossary and the entries in your glossary as you see fit. But we're going to start with a basis, right? So a glossary entry template, and this is for unilingual, okay, glossaries, but it's the same idea for a multilingual glossary. You have specific things, specific items that are incredibly relevant for you to have a useful glossary. All right, and make a good use of technical terms in your work as a translator or whatever work you do, because having glossaries is actually pretty useful if you work with language in general, or even if you just work in a specific area and you read or need to write a lot in a different language. It's very, very useful. And it's fun. I think it's fun. Maybe it's a little bit nerd of me to say that, but I like words, I like language, of course, otherwise I wouldn't be a translator. And I like research, so yay. Everything you need to like glossaries. So glossary entry template. This an adaptation of an excerpt from a material elaborated by a professor from University of Brasília, and I translated it myself, so it's not the actual items that she put in, and there are many ways that people are gonna name these categories and these points, and I'm gonna mention a few of them, all right, as we go about. So a template, you can make it however you like. You can make physical cards for glossary, that's kind of outdated. You can have a Word glossary, you can have my personal favorite, an Excel glossary, an interactive Excel glossary, which is super fun to make and to feed. So I suggest that for every translator. And you can have a multitude of other ways to make it, right? Anything your imagination can come up with. So let's start here. We have an entry, and the entry, it's gonna be your term, right? It's the technical term. And of course, when you are talking about the glossary, you may sometimes find the need to, or just find it useful to have some other types of words or terms that are not technical in your glossary, all right? And it's your glossary, you can put whatever you want. However, it is very important, very relevant to have technical terms here, but you can include important or commonly used words in that area, or terms that you need to remember to keep the same way, or metaphors that in some areas are very used. You can be creative, all right? But here, let's pretend we're just putting in some technical terms. So the entry is gonna be your technical term, the lexical unit that you are gonna be working with. So this can be anything, right? This could be, for instance, glossary. If you're gonna define glossary and you put it in your glossary, the word glossary. That's a terrible example, but just to point out that you could put whatever. And so a glossary is basically a compound of entries, all right? So many terms put together to create a glossary. So the entry is the first thing you're gonna put when you're making an entry in a glossary. It's gonna identify what you're talking about. It's the most important part of it. And there is usually one definition for this entry, and this definition only appears in this entry. You cannot have two entries in the same glossary with, I mean, you can, but you shouldn't have two entries with the same definition, because that's going to be confusing, right? So you have an entry, which is your main term in the language. Then you're going to put the grammatical category. Now that is the part of speech, right? The type of word or language unit you're talking about. Just like in dictionaries, you can have nouns, you can have adverbs. You put it there. It is extremely important. Some people don't think so, but if you think about it, it makes sense. We have many words that across the different languages that are exactly the same. They sound the same, they are written, spelled the same, when they are nouns, when they are verbs, and they have some smaller units, three-letter words, they have many meanings. And so it becomes more important to specify what you're talking about. So grammatical category is the first thing you're gonna put in your entry. Everything that is in yellow in the slide should be a part of a glossary. Even the most concise glossary should have at least this for it to be useful to you or to whomever is checking on it. Because sometimes we think, oh, but it's my glossary. I don't need that because I'm gonna remember things. And sure, you're gonna remember it in a week, or in a month, but when you were checking it 5 years from now, you're not going to remember what the context you found is, or it's gonna become a thing. The more things you translate, the more work you do, things get trickier to remember. So let's help ourselves by making it the most useful possible. All right. Now, gender is the first thing we're going to put in this glossary, that it's not mandatory per se, and it is relevant depending on the language you're talking about. It's more relevant than for other languages, but it is something to consider when making a glossary, whether you need or don't need the gender there. Alternate terms, and then you get synonyms. Bruna, what's the difference? I ask, and I'm gonna answer to you. So, alternate terms, they do not ever appear in the same use. Like if you're gonna use one, you necessarily are gonna give up the other. All right. This can be merely a spelling thing, like when you have two spellings for the same language in different countries, like UK and US spelling for English. You can consider those alternate terms. All right. They substitute one another in your text or in your context. They're never going to appear like one in a paragraph and the other in the next paragraph, because they really are substitutes. And then you have synonyms. Synonyms, on the other hand, you are going to use them depending on the context in the same text, right? To make your text more fluid and less repetitive, depending on the type of text, all right? The idea here is a word that has the same meaning or close to the same meaning, and depending on the context, it's more or less useful, and depending on your context, it's going to be more or less relevant to put these entries, these topics, these items in your entries. All right. In certain areas, it's very useful, and I do recommend people use them. For instance, as I said, I have been working with legal texts for over 10 years now, and you have many different ways of saying the same thing, the same context, the same concept, and in different countries, because a lot of countries have English as their first language, and they have their own concepts and their own words sometimes. And then I find it very useful and for my legal glossary to enter synonyms and alternate terms, because I make sure that I am not gonna, or my teammates are not gonna get confused, because they already know that, oh, yes, I found this here when doing my research, but look, it is just an alternate term and we are using this one because it's our preferred term. All right. And it's also very helpful if you need to localize something, right, for a specific audience, if you already have the alternate terms. And synonyms are useful if you need to avoid repetition in your test. So then we go back to mandatory items with subject area or field. And this is basically more relevant when you have more than one type of field that we work with. I usually recommend creating different glossaries for different subject fields, but you may want to put them together, or sometimes it makes sense to have them together if you don't work very often, and it's going to be a small glossary, and then you can put them all there and you can identify, oh, this is here. Let's say you're making a glossary for legal economics, right? My area. So you get, I have different ones because I work with it a lot, but let's say you need to translate one text, one paper, and it talks about legal aspects of economics. So you have things about the economy, and you have economic concepts, and you have some legal terminology all together, but it's all related because it's all about this only text you're working with. So it would make sense if you're not going to be working with it afterwards. You don't need three different glossaries, right? You don't need one for legal terms, one for economic terms, one for legal terms related to the economy, like for instance with competition, which is something I have, a glossary only for competition legal terms. So you have one, you identify the subject area to make sure that the entries are useful later on when you need to come back and check on it. And then you have what is probably the most important thing, the definition. And here we're seeing, of course, an entry template for a monolingual glossary, but for translations, that's also the most relevant thing, because you need to make sure that the two terms in the different languages have the same definition. And how do you do that? You do that by checking, finding out the definition of these terms and matching them, making sure they are the same, because if they aren't, you do not have a useful translation for that term, and you need to keep searching. Okay, or you need to get creative and explain your term, or do any other thing that can help your text to be accurate without having a specific translated term. Then, and I think this should be also yellow, the source of the definition. And I believe that because, as I said, the relevance of your glossary is gonna be, it's gonna rely on the, how can I say this? Basically the relevance of the content you put in the entry, right? So if it is something that's sketchy, if you got it like from a weird page on the internet, that's much less likely to be relevant and useful for you in the future. So providing the source of the definition helps you to know where it came from and how useful and valid that source is, right? Because if you have an expert in the area defining a term in a book, or if you have it in the page of a university, it's much more relevant, much more likely to be accurate and precise and etc. than if you just see it in a shot on Facebook. I mean, nobody uses Facebook anymore, but you get it. Then we go to the context, which I also think is fundamental for you to have a good glossary for translators. Why is that? Because context is everything from translation, right? If you don't have context, can you even translate? And in this case, if you're referencing this glossary entry in the future, you're probably going to want to know where it came from and how it was used. And why is that? Because you are going to be able to assess whether it is a good option for your new translation, right? The new thing you're working on. You're going to figure out if it's still relevant, if that is the same idea, the same context. All right, so same thing for source of context. If you put the context, you should put the source of the context, because that's good for future you. When you're checking it, it is easier to assess if that is a good translation option for your new situation. All right. Then we have semantic relations. Of course, synonym and alternate terms are semantic relations, but they are put separate because they are kind of more relevant and more used. Here I have only put 3 semantic relations. Of course, there are many more, depending on who you ask. But these are, I believe, the most relevant, especially for translators. So you have hypernym, and that is what we call an umbrella term, so which is a broader term, a wider concept that is related to your word. So if you have dog in your entry, you could put mammal as a hypernym, right? Because it's a broader category. And hyponym, which is the opposite. So if you have a citric fruit glossary entry, you could put orange or grapefruit as a hyponym. And then you have converse terms, and these are those terms that are related in idea, in meaning, in their concepts, but they aren't otherwise alike. For example, you could have a puppy and a dog. These are converse terms because you see that puppy is not a type of dog. It is a relationship, like it's a younger, smaller dog. And so the concepts are related in this sense. So you could have a father-daughter, you could have many types of relationships. You could also put here in semantic relations antonyms and other related words, however you see fit. Or alternatively, you could put this information, whatever relevant information you find in terms of semantic relations, you could put them in the notes, and we're going to talk more about that. Now here we have equivalent terms, and sorry, and this of course is I'm sorry. This of course is because it's a monolingual glossary entry template for translations for translators. That's hardly useful. You shouldn't use that. It's less than ideal, right? The most appropriate and most useful thing for translators the most useful things for translators is to repeat the items for both languages, right? So you have the entry in one language and you have the entry in the other language, and you have the grammatical category, which should be the same, and the gender, which can or cannot be the same, that depends. And then you have alternate terms, synonyms, and the subject area, of course, needs to be the same, and the definition needs to be the same, but you should have both in both languages, right? Definition, that's how you check that this is actually the appropriate term. So you have the term in English, and you have the definition in English from a good source, and then you have this term in Portuguese or Spanish, French, Russian, whatever, and you have the definition in that language, and the definitions should be the same, but they should have different sources from good sources in different language, in the different language you're using. Okay, so you get one definition, for instance, from a Harvard professor in a text for this term, and then you get a different definition from a textbook used in Brazil for the Portuguese one. And the definitions, when you see, they should be exactly the same idea. All right, and an important thing about the definition, sometimes you're going to define the term because it's kind of an obvious thing and you just don't want to bother researching, and but you do need to remember it. And when you're defining your text, or when you're searching for a definition in whatever source you find, you should make sure, for good practice, not to use that term in the definition, because that's kind of a bore, right? And less than ideal and not very useful. If you're gonna see what love is, and somebody says, love is the feeling you have or you feel when you are in love. That doesn't say anything, that doesn't mean anything, right? That's completely useless. So let's not do that, all right? So if a definition is saying something like that, that's gonna have you go research more, it's useless. You should have something that is specific and in simple language, as simple as possible. Of course, if it's a very specific and elaborate concept in a very specific specialized area, it's gonna be more complex, it's gonna use more complex words, but we should try to get the plainest terms, the plainest definition, because if with simpler words, it is more likely to be understood, and it's more likely that you are gonna get an accurate translation if you find the two definitions similar in both languages, all right? And, all right, so equivalent terms you shouldn't have in a multilingual glossary for translation. Many people do only have lists of equivalents, and they call it a glossary. It is less than ideal for the points we mentioned earlier, but I mean, to each their own, right? Do whatever you find useful, but ideally, we are gonna have a sort of two cards, two entries that are exactly the same, but in different languages, all right? That's the most useful glossary template for translators. So the equivalent term, of course, you're not gonna use. I mean, you can, right? As we said, it's your glossary, it's your terminology research, you do you, but less than ideal. Then you get the notes. And here is what I find very interesting and very particular to each translator. Many of these things that are not mandatory to have in your glossary entry, if you create, for example, in my case, in Excel, and you put this there to be filled, many times you're not going to have anything to put in those. So what I do, particularly in the case of semantic relations and alternate terms and synonyms, is I put everything in this, everything that's relevant for me within the notes or observations, or however you want to call this topic. And I always have it, even though it's not mandatory, because many times you find something to add to this item. Like you can have, for instance, if you work with a 10 and you decide that you are gonna that your preferred term is this one, you put it there. Like, do not use X, or preferred term is Y, or such term is prohibited, do not use. Like sometimes you have these sort of things and you can put there, or you have a tricky concept that is similar, but that you can't really put it here. So you can put a note here that says, check such term, and things like that. It's really, it has potential. It's what I'm saying. You can really customize it and use it as you please, and that saves a lot of space for you, especially because as translators, if you are going to put the most important items for both languages, it's already a big card, a big entry, right? Because it's doubled. Even if it's the simplest one, it's going to be double the size. And then you have author, and I did not translate this one. But you have, you should make sure, especially if you work with a team, to put down who wrote, who did the research, okay? And name this person. And if it's yourself, and if it's only for yourself, you might not want to do this. I mean, only I added this thing. Okay, great. And then you have editor. In case you need to have somebody else like type your entries, or if you're working with a team and other people are gonna be writing things and stuff, it's important to point out who wrote it and who edited it and the date. All right, the date is relevant too, because sometimes, especially working with a team, you're gonna search and you're gonna find more than one entry for the same thing. And if you have who wrote it, who edited, and the date, it is easier to assess which one is more relevant or which one was decided and who is more, who has more authority for that. It is relevant. Of course, the way you're gonna do it is really up to you, but it should be a thing to think about as translators, how we are doing our translations when it comes to technical terms. Are we doing proper research? Are we trusting automatic translation, for instance? That's a rookie mistake, because I mean, not against automated anything, but we should use it for our benefit. And that means you need to know when it is a good fit and when it isn't, right? And for more specialized concepts, it might be bad for you. It might come up to really a less than ideal translation, all right? So we want to avoid that. And so when you're doing your research, when you're translating, and as a translator or as an interpreter, make sure you try and identify what is a technical term or what units you think could be technical terms, and make sure to check the definition. That's the only way you're gonna make sure you're gonna be able to assess options, your translation options, okay, to see which one is fit, which isn't, which one you can consider, maybe even if they are less than ideal, because sometimes it's really tricky to find an accurate translation, but the idea is sort of the same, and I can maybe use these and, I don't know, explain the difference, just add something. It's your thing. This helps, all right? But we need to be able to solve this issue with translation terms. We need to first be able to identify what is a technical term. How do I go about researching them? So that's basically it. I'm gonna end by telling you about a translation term that I found, and that is very usually mistranslated, very commonly mistranslated, which is nota técnica. Now, this is a term in Portuguese that is pretty much the same as parecer, right? However, and here's the tricky thing, it is used in Brazil, at least in Portuguese, slightly different, right? So what you have is a parecer is an expert opinion written by any expert, right? About something, a topic, whatever. And a nota técnica is an opinion as well, also by an expert. However, it usually contains legal analysis. So it usually quotes legislation, analyzes legislation related to the topic. It has this legal aspect, right? Now, here's the fun thing. So you get to translate this, and it is different. The definitions are different, right? So what you have as in an expert opinion is an opinion written by an expert, which is parecer. And it's a quasi synonym, right, with nota técnica. However, you do not have, or at least I haven't found, a synonym in English that has this meaning, right? That includes this specific thing of having legislation in the analysis, be a part of the analysis. So what do, right? And the first thing I can tell is do not use automated translation, because every single machine translation that I have seen is going to translate it as technical note. And technical note is a whole different thing, right? It is a type of article, paper, and it has nothing to do with a opinion on this, on an expert opinion. So do not use machine translation. And now, is there an ideal way or a right way to translate this? I don't know. There are many options, right? And the option I went with is just ignore the difference between parecer and nota técnica and just put both as expert opinion. And the reason for that is it doesn't matter for my audience, right? I currently work at the Public Defender's Office, and it is irrelevant for the UN audience, the international audience, the difference in the definition of the terms in Portuguese, all right? The people who are going to read this text, they are going to read it because they have to read it because it's important. They're not going to care about this slight different definition because they are unaware that there are two different things for this in Portuguese, because in English is just one, right? An expert opinion can contain legal aspects. It can be included in the analysis made by in this type of opinion, right? Not all of them have it, but it can be a part of it. So it's one concept in English, and pointing out, I could add that it is an expert opinion with legal context, legal analysis. But that's completely irrelevant. And it just seems like it's gonna be a bore and add something that nobody cares about, right? It's literally not gonna be an issue ever for somebody. When someone gets something that we translated and it's written their expert opinion, they are not gonna, it's not gonna be different for them if they get expert opinion with legal analysis, all right? The people who are gonna read it, they're gonna read it nonetheless. So yeah, what we did is simplify. We just ignore the difference in Portuguese, right? Different translators would choose to go about this differently. I'm not saying mine is the right way. Mine is the way we found to be appropriate for what we need, right? And that's what you need to do too with your work, and just do you, but you should be aware of the choices you're making, and that's where identifying these terms and making sure you know what they mean and what your options are is important. All right. Well, that's it for all. Thank you. I hope this was useful to you. And again, it was an honor to be here. I'm really glad for the opportunity. Thank you.